Hello. Welcome. It's so great to see all of you here. Let me first introduce myself. My name is Sharon Godot, and I'm professor of Asian American Studies and Psychology at Pomona College and also the Pomona Colleges. I was just reflecting back that when I first came to the college, there was a Department of Africana Studies, a Department of Chicano Studies, and the idea of an Asian American Studies department was just that, an idea. So it's really, really fantastic to see you all here. And it's with excitement and great pleasure that I welcome you to this lecture, which is event 4 of the Intercollegiate Department of Asian American Studies Signature Event Series. It's on Manzanar. Before I start, I just wanted to say that there's some filming going on, so if you would prefer not to be filmed, if you could raise your hand, we'll just take a look. So, okay. I want to invite you to peruse the exhibit of the Sue Kunitomi Embrey papers in the Asian Library under the curatorship of the Asian Librarian Judy Zhou. It's now open through May 30th, and that's on the 3rd floor. I also want to say that there may be some spots available for the 5th event in the series, and that is the 50th annual Manzanar Pilgrimage. That's taking place on Saturday, April 27th at 7 o'clock. It's going to be departing from campus. So if you think you'd like to go, I think it would be a very special year to go do that. You can go, there's some paperwork back there, or you can speak to Professor Miyake or Madeline Kosiaka. I also want to say that there's a buffet reception and dinner following today's talk on the 3rd floor, again, the Asian Library. And I invite you all to stick around and enjoy some food and also the exhibit. So I am not introducing the speaker, but I am going to introduce the person who's introducing the speaker. So this is Professor Char Miller. He is a W.M. Keck Professor of Environmental Analysis and History. And please welcome him.
Thank you so much. It is a thrill that Monica is back with us now, which is evident, I think, by the number of her former faculty who are in this room. She was a dynamic presence when she was a student here, graduated in 2009. Wrote one of the most extraordinary EA senior theses I've had the pleasure to read. A really dynamic piece in its own right, but also transformative in terms of how many of us started to think about environmental history and more broadly environmental justice. So much so that I was thrilled when I corralled her gently to write an essay for a book I just published this past January, a collection of essays called The Nature of Hope, and in which Monica wrote a stunning piece in which she talked about her activism in North Carolina, the fight against coal-fired plants in that state, and the mechanism by which she did it. That was the most important piece of this, is to really lay out the step-by-step process. When you're an activist, you don't have a lot of time, you're moving quickly, but Monica has this capacity to do that at the same time. She can step back and reflect on what's going on, which makes her chapter really magical. You're about to see that magic in a moment, so please help me welcome Monica Embrey to the stage. Thank you.
Everyone for coming today. It's really wonderful. I was just joking with Charles. It feels like coming home. So it's good to be back here on campus and really appreciate the time and space to talk with you all today. So my name is Monica Embrey, and I did graduate in 2009. But most of my talk today, I'm actually going to be focusing on my grandmother. And her name was Sue Embrey. Later became Embrey. Sue Kunitomi is where she was born. She was born on January 6, 1923, in Little Tokyo. And she was a Nisei, a second-generation Japanese-American here in California. The daughter of Onikichi and Komika, and was one of 8 siblings, one of 8 kids. And when she was growing up, life was sometimes hard. Her father actually passed away in 1937. And that caused a lot of hardship on the family, the single mother with 8 kids. There was also the cultural context of anti-Japanese sentiment in the community, right, in Little Tokyo and across California, and pending war. And so my great-grandmother, Bachan, was lucky because there's a family who actually decided to move back to Japan and sold a store, a general store, to her to help become economically be able to take care of the family. And they sold it to her for a pretty affordable price. And so that's where Bachan and my grandmother and her siblings worked. And so after my grandmother graduated from Lincoln High School, that's her patch, graduating from Lincoln High School. Any Lincoln High School in the house? All right. She had dreams of going to college, but she wasn't able to afford it. And so after graduating, she started working in the family store. And she was working in the family store one day and had the radio on, and news broke that Japan had bombed Pearl Harbor, and she knew something serious was going to happen. And so what happened afterwards dramatically changed and transformed her entire life and my life as her grandchild. And so to understand exactly what happened, we actually have to go even further back in history before my grandmother was born. So there are many long histories in this country of anti-Asian racism. And one of the first kind of codifications of that in law was specifically the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, which prevented and prohibited the immigration of all Chinese laborers. This was an act that was passed that grew upon the 1875 Page Act, which specifically banned Chinese women from immigrating, and became the first law in US history to prevent all members of a specific ethnic group from immigrating to this country. And that set the stage for what became a term called yellow peril in the early 1900s. And it was a term and concept that was developed specifically actually to target Asian but also Japanese communities. It talked about the quote-unquote threat of the Japanese and a pending invasion to the United States. And it was used and often propagated in many forms of propaganda, including here in California, the William Randolph Hearst newspapers, who were often feeding this fever of deep racism. You can see it may be hard to read at the bottom of this ad. It says, "The Yellow Terror in all its glory." And that yellow peril propaganda was spread throughout newspapers, magazines, cultural contexts, right? You had articles like this one where the Building Trades Union was calling for an arm against the yellow peril. You had this film developed, and this film ad in 1916 called The Yellow Menace. Was, as you can see on the left side there, it says, "produced to arouse sleeping Americans." So lots of different efforts were taking place at this time to help build up anti-Japanese sentiment specifically. And that continued to then be codified into law. So the California Alien Land Law of 1913, also known as the Webb-Haney Act, prohibited, quote, aliens ineligible for citizenship from owning agricultural land. And this primarily targeted Japanese, though it did have impacts for all Asian immigrants. And the purpose of it really was to create a hostile climate for those who are currently living in the US and incentivize and discourage any immigration of new Japanese immigrants to come. These laws continued at the federal level with the Immigration Acts of 1917, which is also known as the Literacy Act or the Asiatic Barred Zone Act. And it effectively passed a literacy test and barred immigration from many countries, including Japan, across the Asian Pacific zone. That law was then updated in 1924 and reduced the cap of Southern and Eastern European immigrants from 3% down to 2%, and specifically banned anyone who was Arab, East Asian, or Indian, with the purpose to be, quote, to preserve the ideal of American homogeneity. And remember, my grandma was born in 1923, right? So this is happening literally the year after she was born. Then there comes the Alien Registration Act of 1940, also known as the Smith Act. And this was a registry. Might sound familiar to some things we think about today. A registry where folks were asked to be fingerprinted. And the hope was, the expectation was between August 27, 1940 and December 26 of that same year, 3.5 million immigrants were supposed to register themselves at 45,000 post offices across the country. If folks did not register within this 4-month window, there were criminal penalties. They needed to register with their name and address, their race, their employer and that address, all the list of every relative they had in the United States, any organizational membership or clubs that they were a part of, if they had applied for citizenship, and any foreign or US military service. So then, that night happens, or that morning happens, when my grandmother's working in the general store in Tokyo. And by that night, on the end of December 7th, 1941, there were FBI raids across Little Tokyo. 5,500 Issei, or first-generation Japanese men, were rounded up and detained. Their families didn't know where they were going. Doors knocked at the end of the night. People stripped and pulled from their families, literally from their beds. They specifically targeted religious leaders, martial arts teachers, business leaders, anyone in the community who was leading in any kind of significant way was taken without any justification or notice. A few months later, FDR signed Executive Order 9066. And this was the call for the unconstitutional incarceration of all persons of Japanese ancestry on the West Coast. It ultimately targeted over 110,000 people of Japanese ancestry, including 2/3 of whom were US citizens, like my grandmother. Their citizenship didn't protect them from this bill. And what's interesting to me is that on the same day that President Roosevelt signed EO 9066, a congressman from Mississippi, Congressman John Rankin, said, quote, "I'm for catching every Japanese in America, Alaska, and Hawaii now, and putting them in concentration camps. Damn them. Let's get rid of them now." And that terminology, concentration camps, used the day that the EO 9066 order was signed. It's pretty significant. So to continue to justify unconstitutional incarceration, the government actually put out quite a bit of anti-Japanese hysteria and propaganda. Ads were put in, like this one of quote-unquote how to spot a Jap and differentiate who is Japanese from other Asian countries. You can see this school child's Jap hunting license that says it's good for open season and no closed season. On yellow belly Japs. Ammunition furnished by Uncle Sam, bag limit Tokyo. And there's an underlying really important economic context that I think is really important to understand, that where did this racism and xenophobia, what was it really also rooted in, was an economic reality, which is that by 1940, Japanese farmers in California produced 35% of all of the crops and were the dominant source of the vegetable and fruit distribution. Many people had immigrated here from Japan to work in the fields and work in farm labor, and had established themselves really strongly in the community and had a really strong economic, vibrant presence. Also by 1940, 61% of California's Japanese were US born. So those laws that prevented the Issei, the first generation, from owning land, didn't apply to their Nisei children, the second generation, who were US citizens and were able to own land. And so many Japanese farmers' children started owning and buying the land on the farms where they were farming. Areas today like Silicon Valley were all Japanese farmland. And so part of what happened with EO 9066 is also one of the largest land grabs in this country, where people lost everything. When EO 9066 was signed and passed, what did that unconstitutional incarceration also did was strip people of their economic wealth. Bank accounts were seized, property was seized, businesses closed, homes, people lost everything. This is actually what Little Tokyo looked like, as all of these businesses in a really racist era was all run by Japanese and Japanese Americans before Japanese and Japanese Americans completely shut down the economic vibrancy of Little Tokyo. And that also happened to my family, right? So my family had a general store in Little Tokyo and had to sell it for half of what they bought it for. That was already actually a really reduced price, right? They were able to actually sell it to a Mexican-American family who was willing to pay for it. Many, many other families had to abandon their homes and their properties without having anyone to give it to. And not to mention everything else that they owned. Folks were given very little time to pack whatever they had. And they were going somewhere, and you could only bring what you could carry. And so you had whatever fit into suitcases. Imagine if you are 19 years old, like my grandmother was, and were told to pack bags because you were going to an unknown place for an unknown amount of time. What would you bring? Did you know where you were going? You didn't. Did you bring appropriate clothing for it? There were some stories of families being worried about having water and food, so they filled suitcases with water bottles and rations. People who were worried about, do you bring your mementos? Do you bring what you think you need to survive? Inside camp, cameras weren't allowed, nor were radios, so you couldn't bring those along. There was no other forms of communication there. And so people got onto trains and buses with blacked out windows and finally landed in a place like this. And my bachan, my great-grandmother, said when she got to Manzanar the next day after the sun rose, looked around and saw a desolate desert and said, "Ma, kon natokoli," which roughly translates to a place like this. This is where they brought us to. And this is where my family would live, at the Manzanar concentration camp. It was one of 10 and the first concentration camp that was built. At its peak had 10,046 incarcerees, and in total 11,070 people were incarcerated there on a 6,200-acre camp. And it wasn't, and this is in the Eastern Sierras, if folks are familiar, that's Mount Whitney in the background up on 395, currently near where towns like Bishop and Lone Pine are located. And so there are many places across the West where this happened, right? So Manzanar is not the only camp. There were multiple, first what they called assembly centers and relocation centers, including one not too far from here, right in Pomona, right? And also the Santa Anita racetracks were used, where people had to literally shovel the horse manure from the stalls where they were going to be sleeping that night as they were rounded up. And eventually, 110,000 people were incarcerated in these camps all across the West. You can see the area that was designated as the exclusion area and where those actual concentration camps and where relocation centers were in relation to those for this forced removal. And so what was life in camp like? What did it mean to be living in a concentration camp? The camp was surrounded by barbed wire and military police. There were 8 armed guard towers with machine guns that faced in, and you were at risk of being shot if you got even close to the barbed wire. There were big spotlights, and if you had to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night, you were living in these barracks, right? 500 square foot barracks without separations between rooms, that had holes in the walls so the wind blew through and the sand blew through that would keep you really cold in the summer and really cold in the winter and really hot in the summer. And if you needed to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night, you would have a spotlight from that watchtower follow you all the way to the bathroom and then all the way back. And speaking of those bathrooms, there were no stalls. There were just open toilets same for the showers, no division, out in the public. And you're in a concentration camp with 10,000 strangers who might be of the same ancestry, but I don't know if you necessarily want to shower or go to the bathroom next to them. I think about what it would be like to have been a teenage girl getting her period for the first time in camp, or newlywed couples who would have no privacy, what it was like to have to raise a family in this type of place. And so my grandmother lived in one of those barracks with her siblings and my grandmother. She was 19, and when she first got there was not a lot to do, so part of what folks did was they made things to do, and one of the efforts was actually a camouflage net factory. And so my grandmother worked actually helping make camouflage nets for the war effort while being a prisoner in her own country. She also ended up finding herself at the camp newspaper, which was named the Manzanar Free Press. And this was a place where she would be able to find her voice both during her time in camp and had pretty significant influence on how she was able to find her voice outside of camp. Manzanar was also distinct in not only being the first of these concentration camps in the US, but it was the only one that actually had an orphanage called the Children's Village. And that was because there was an order for children who were in foster care or orphanages who were of Japanese ancestry to be taken from those homes and incarcerated along with the rest of the Japanese and Japanese American community. In June of 1942, 61 children were taken to be held at Children's Village, and in total 101 kids were held here until it closed in September 1945. So after my grandmother was able to leave camp, she didn't stay in California. She actually went to the Midwest. And that was true of many people leaving camps. They actually, many stayed in California and the West Coast, and many left. And that's because the sentiment against Japanese and Japanese Americans was inhospitable. I don't know if a word can be strong enough to describe how rough it was. You saw signs like this one: "We don't want any Japs back here ever." And you can see people proudly standing behind these signs, right? Army ban on return of Nisei to the coast is lifted. Protest scene was a Seattle newspaper. So my grandmother left Manzanar and actually first went to Madison, Wisconsin, and ended up in Chicago before moving back to LA. And again, to clarify exactly why that continued racism, building on what was already developing with the Yellow Peril of the late 1800s and early 1900s, was really strong anti-Japanese sentiment after camps. You saw pretty significant housing discrimination, where people were unable to find places to rent, let alone buy, to be able to return back to homes. Those who did find homes and properties often found them vandalized and were under attack themselves. And you could see the impact of their neighbors in having just the outright audacity to call for what they thought was needed. And that continued also not just in housing, but of course workplace discrimination. So even if you were able to find somewhere to live, could you find somewhere to work and be able to sustain and support your family as the anti-Japanese specific sentiment grew? And so my grandmother in her early 20s and 30s actually moved back to LA as her mother, Bachan, was getting older and sick and needing care. So she moved back from Chicago here to LA and started getting involved in politics. And part of that was because of understanding the experiences that she had just went through. I mentioned when she was in camp, she worked at the newspaper, the Free Press. Well, the editor of the Free Press happened to be a woman who was a cigarette-smoking and whiskey-drinking, loud-voiced woman who was willing to stand up to men. And that was one of the first women she'd ever seen who was willing to stand up to men. In Chicago, my grandmother worked at the Newberry Library, which was one of the first times she'd ever been in a multiracial setting. where she worked directly with white and black women librarians. And that was a really transformative experience for her. And so when she came back to LA, she was living in Little Tokyo and reading the Rafushinko, which is a local newspaper, and she saw an ad for a group called the Nisei Progressives. And they were asking for volunteers to come join the Henry Wallace President campaign. And the Nisei Progressives were a group of second-generation Japanese Americans who were calling for justice and equity. They wanted demands on redress and reparations. They wanted an end to the anti-immigrant laws, an end to anti-miscegenation. They were really calling for equity and justice in a way that she had never seen before. And so she joined the campaign and started volunteering. She started learning how to go door to door and talk to the community members and other Japanese Americans about progressive values and equity and justice. It was there that she met her husband, my grandpa. They got married in 1950, just 2 years after anti-miscegenation laws were ended. And that played a pretty big role in when my grandmother went and decided to go on that first pilgrimage. So in December of 1969, in the backdrop of a growing civil rights movement, a bunch of students, including many from UCLA, were sansei, the third generation, and they were calling to understand what had happened to their parents and grandparents. Because if you can imagine the trauma, the PTSD of having been incarcerated in a concentration camp, even though you have been a US citizen and a constitution that was supposed to protect you, these folks, this third generation, didn't know what was happening, didn't understand what their families had gone through. And so we're asking questions. They had, one of the first folks who went on that was someone named Warren Furatani, and he shares that lots of folks were marching, and they decided that they needed to have their march. Didn't quite realize how far Manzanar was from LA, but decided to do a carpool trip instead. So groups of folks invited my grandmother and other people who'd actually been incarcerated to go back and see what it was like. And so here they are, and here my grandmother is, all the way here on the right with the glasses. She had the best cat eye glasses. And she was asked to tell some stories of what it was like to be in camp. What were those experiences for her? What happened? And she was sharing stories not only with the sansei who were asking questions, but they were actually invited the local media and the LA Times. And all of a sudden my grandmother was starting to tell her story on a much bigger stage than she had before. This became a pretty formative and important moment where she realized there were people who cared and people who wanted to make a difference and people who were going to work with her and others to fight for redress, reparations, equity, and justice. So not too late after, she helped form the Manzanar Committee, and this became the vehicle through which she did all of her organizing for many decades. She explained that before the forced removal, before the incarceration, the Japanese and Japanese American community was vibrant and strong. The community was really socially connected with one another and very engaged with its cultural roots, right? We would have dances and festivals very similar to what was happening in Japan. And economically strong. There was a strong business community, farmers, people were starting to own their lands. But what was missing was political power. That the Japanese and Japanese American community had social, cultural, and economic power didn't matter when it came to their forced removal because they didn't have political power. And that's why they became a community that was so easy to incarcerate. That's why no one spoke out against them except for a few quiet voices. Not even those who you usually expect to speak out against rape and injustice. And so by forming the Manzanar Committee, part of its mission was, of course, to educate and engage the community and agitate and fight and organize for redress and reparations, to tell the story, but it was also to build power for the community. One of the first things that happened actually was having to tell your own stories. So this text on the left called The Lost Years was something my grandmother and the Manzanar Committee published to tell their own story of exactly what had happened and why it had happened. And you'll see her standing here on the right side with that tag, which is the tags that they used to actually label folks when they were lining up for their luggage. You might have seen that in the photo. When folks were waiting to get on the trains and the buses, they wear tags to mark people with numbers and reduce prisoners down to family ID numbers. And so they did this work to really tell the story, created a logo with the barbed wire, right, to really help tell what was happening and actually doing this story. Going back to Manzanar was no longer a trauma, it was a healing space. It was a place to legitimize what had happened and share stories. It was a place to share lessons with the sansei who weren't there, whose parents were, and explain what had happened. It was a way to build political power. And they did. And so that first pilgrimage was 1969 in December. A couple months later, they formed the Manzanar Committee. And within 2 years, they actually got Manzanar established as a state historic landmark. So in 1973, in April 14th, this landmark was established as the 850th landmark. And the plaque that was listed here, it might be a little hard to read, has some really important words on it. And it's actually in this second part that I want to call you to. It specifically uses the word concentration camp. And you'll remember that racist congressman who used that word on the same day at EO 9066. But concentration camp isn't often the term that the government or even many of our textbooks use. We'll use euphemisms like internment or relocation to cover up what actually happened. But the definition of internment is only for those who are non-citizens. Concentration camp is actually the definition of what happened. And my grandmother made a very strong point and fought very hard, including publishing many papers, on why our language matters. And the terminology that we use to understand our stories and reclaiming those stories for our own words and telling that is correct. She called what happened in the Holocaust death camps, because that's what those were. And the pilgrimages continued. So what started as a bunch of sansei students and a couple of nisei going on a bus became bigger and bigger. And so soon in the 1970s, as the backdrop of the civil rights movement is growing, the pilgrimages become an annual legacy. And they're used to raise the demand for justice, including the demand for redress and reparations. Part of what I named earlier was that this was an economic factor. What happened was an economic land grab. People lost their businesses, people lost their homes, people lost the ability to have access to their bank accounts were seized. And so the wrongs of what happened, when people lost everything and were forced to live in concentration camps for years, needed actual redress and paid reparations. And so a growing movement was born in the 70s and in the 80s. And in 1980, Congress called for the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians to study, okay, what had actually happened and how bad was it and what needs to be done in response. And this was an incredibly important moment for the Japanese and Japanese American community. Because throughout the 70s, many in the community were still scared about speaking out. Your citizenship hadn't protected you from incarceration. If you rocked the boat, what would they do next? The anti-Asian sentiment was still around. People were really concerned about calling for redress and reparations. So many in the community asked people to be quiet and hush, asked for my grandmother and others to not speak out and not demand justice. And that was true not only of the community, but actually my grandmother's own family were asking her to not put a target on their back because they were so scared of what would happen. And so these hearings, they actually had field hearings, including here in Los Angeles, became an opportunity for the sansei for the third generation to organize their parents and their grandparents to speak out. And they started working to coach their parents and grandparents to tell their stories for the first time. Many of them had never told them as kids what had happened growing up. And now they were being asked to sit in a court in front of the federal government and testify. That was a pretty terrifying prospect for many who had just endured the trauma of incarceration. And yet it worked. And thanks to the continued growing movement of many organizations and many leaders, people testified and stories came out hour after hour, tears and rage. And what happened then was in 1983, This commission published a report that said the incarceration was not justified by military necessity. It said it was based on, and I quote, race, prejudice, war hysteria, and the failure of political leadership. So this is the first really significant recognition at the federal level that this was wrong. This became an incredible movement in the community to see that actually the demands and organizing work had worked. It resulted in a government apology, reparations, and a commitment to public education to make sure such an injustice would never happen again. And so the pilgrimages continue to be this important place to educate and engage the community, to let them know. It also started changing after the federal government formally recognized that what happened was unacceptable. It became okay for people to go to camp. And so my grandmother's siblings and other family members and others in the community actually started going on these annual pilgrimages back for the first time to see where they had been. And the movement continued. In 1985, Manzanar was designated a National Historic Landmark. So not just a state California landmark, but now a national landmark. And that recognition was in part able to happen because of that. And in 1988, a formal apology from the president was listed. And Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act, which formally apologized. Here you actually have George Bush Sr. having signed that letter. And in it, he quotes that, let's see if I can actually move this over here to read this really quick. A monetary sum and words alone cannot restore lost years. My grandma got a kick out of the fact that he used her book title in the apology letter. Or erase painful memories, and neither can they fully convey our nation's resolve to rectify injustice and to uphold the rights of individuals. We can never fully right the wrongs of the past, but we can take a clear stand for justice and recognize that serious injustices were done to Japanese Americans during World War II. In enacting a law calling for restitution and offering a sincere apology, your fellow Americans have, in a very real sense, renewed their traditional commitment to the ideals of freedom, equality, and justice. You and your family have our best wishes for the future. And accompanying this letter was a check, a reparation check for $20,000. It was given to 82,210 surviving Japanese Americans. And the pilgrimages continued. And in the 90s, a lot of the work really continued to focus on that third commitment by the government. So there was an apology, there was a reparation check, and there was a commitment to public education to ensure this would never happen again to anyone. And to ensure that was actually enacted, my grandmother wanted to make sure the correct type of interpretation of the story happened. And so she shared that democracy is a fragile concept, only as good and strong as the people who practice it. So let us tell the world that we are a people strong and resolute, acknowledging the errors of the past in order to not repeat them in the future. This is the legacy which we believe the Manzanar National Historic Site can leave for future generations, for Americans of every color and creed to learn from the past and to guide us in the future, to strengthen equal justice under the law towards brotherhood and human dignity. And part of what happened is we finally won. And we made Manzanar into a National Historic Site in 1992. This would encompass having National Park Service actually take over the grounds and developing an interpretive center with staff who would be the ones telling the story to make sure that what had happened to my grandmother and 110,000 other people would be remembered even years after they would pass. And the pilgrimages continued, and the political relevance today, after what had happened in 9/11, made these pilgrimages in the early 2000s until today all the more relevant. Because as there was a renewed commitment for the federal government to recognize and tell this story, there was this sixth challenge actually happening to many Arab and Muslim Americans. And so many of the pilgrimages, and continue to this day, to be in solidarity with those communities. And in 2004, the Interpretive Center opened. And my grandmother worked for many, many years to help tell this story. She actually had a park ranger spend some time in her basement to help get the real story and learn from her of what had happened. And so stories like this one need to be told. And too many of us have died without telling our stories. The Interpretive Center is important because it needs to show the world that America is strong as it makes amends for the wrongs it has committed, and that we will always remember Manzanar because of that. That's what my grandmother shared when they broke the ground at this place. The center today continues to be a world-class museum of sorts, and you will be able to visit it actually if you do go on the pilgrimage next week and really see the story that was told there from the perspective of the people who were incarcerated there. They've also done quite a bit of work to help people really understand what that looks like, including a reconstructed guard tower, a reconstruction of those barracks, and a reconstruction of the bathrooms. In total, my grandmother led 36 annual pilgrimages. She led them until she passed away. And these continue to be a really important legacy that we have to continue. Thanks to all of her work, she earned a few titles. Some folks call her the Mother of Manzanar. A book was published on her titled The Unquiet Niece. My favorite, though, is from my uncle, my great-uncle Jack. When they were kids, they would play football on gravel. And to be a part of their club, you had to be pretty hardcore. And they called their club the Baka Guts Club. And Baka in Japanese means stupid. And so you had to have stupid guts to play in their football club. And as my grandmother, as she passed, her brother formally inaugurated her into the Baka Guts Club for all of the work that she had done for preserving Manzanar. And so she passed in May of 2006. She had many different respiratory illnesses. And that was really hard for me, personally, because I decided to come here to Pomona because she lived in LA, and I wanted to be close to her. And so I had applied to a scholarship called Posse and came here, and during my first year at Pomona, I was taking the Metrolink from campus out to Echo Park to visit her, and I saw her get more and more sick until she passed. And that became then very confusing, because the reason I had come to California, the reason I'd come to Pomona was to learn and be close to my grandmother. And so I had to do some redirection and redefining of what I wanted. It's my little brother up there with me. It was thanks to some really incredible mentors that are here in this room, Char Miller and Zefa Aina, Miyake Sensei, and Darren Moko, Maria Tucker, Rick Towns, Shariar Shariari. Thanks to all of your leadership and mentorship and support that I was able to keep staying on campus, did not drop out, though I came to your office asking to do so, and started using her legacy to inform my own education and my own direction. And so part of what we did is actually through my work here on campus at the Asian American Resource Center and as an AMP mentor, started having pilgrimages. And we bought actually buses from the Claremont campuses out to Manzanar. And so I did that for my sophomore, junior, and senior year. And I also decided to take some classes in ethnic studies, Asian American studies, gender, women's studies, politics, and environmental analysis, specifically to learn about what had happened. I wanted to understand why my grandmother had passed away from respiratory disease at 83 years old, even though she'd never smoked a day in her life. And I had the opportunity through classes and writing my thesis here to do a ton of research into that, and realized that part of it became that she was exposed to air toxins during her time. During her time growing up in Los Angeles, this polluted air basin, breathing in toxic air from fossil fuel industry emissions, and during her time at Manzanar, because some folks know that area, Owens Lake, for how we've drained that to build the empire that is LA, and the water history from, perhaps you've seen a movie called Chinatown. And so that lake, when it was drained, actually allowed particulate matter 2.5 and other fine dust to get lodged in people's lungs, and that causes different respiratory illnesses. And so I was able here at Pomona to make the connection between what happened to my grandmother's health, and I decided to study environmental justice studies. And that has informed my current personal life, to understand that not every community faces the same impacts of environmental burdens, and that issues of power, race, class, gender actually have pretty significant impacts to who gets to breathe dirtier air and what impact that has on our life. And so following in my family's legacy, I became a community organizer and have worked across many different places, from Chicago, Indiana, Michigan, North Carolina, now New Mexico and California, to demand justice and fight against the dirty fossil fuel industry that is making us sick and causing global climate chaos, and also building up the 100% clean, renewable energy that we all deserve, and making sure that's equitable and done in a way that we all can have access to. I do that rooted in some pretty important environmental justice principles and theory that I actually got to learn here at Pomona. And so learning the theory and actually putting it into practice through praxis was pretty incredible. I learned about the importance of being inclusive, emphasis on bottom-up organizing, and letting people speak for themselves, working together in solidarity and mutuality, building just relationships among ourselves, and a commitment to self-transformation. And I learned in reading this theory and studying it here at Pomona that actually my grandmother embodied all of those same values and characteristics in the way that she did her work and how she organized. And so I had an incredible opportunity, as Char mentioned, to contribute a chapter in his book, The Nature of Her Hope, that got published earlier this year, and really stay rooted in this fact that we do this work to be building up the better world that we want. This is one of, if you ever get an email from me, you'll see this quote in my email signature, which is that if you come to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you've come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. And that also felt like what my grandmother held to be true. And I feel really lucky because I don't do this alone. I have a family that also does this. I have my dad, Bruce, and my aunt, Carrie, and T.V., and Uncle Ed, who are here. There's folks who continue the legacy of the Manzanar Committee and continue my grandmother's work. We still go every year to a pilgrimage. I've been every year since I was in middle school. And the night before, we sit around in the hotel and make spam musubi together. We don't have to stuff programs anymore. The next day, we help run the program actually together and dance at the end. And so the pilgrimages, for me personally, are how I stay grounded and rooted in my political work. They're how I stay grounded and rooted in my family and my connection to community, and grounded and rooted in my values. And today, these feel so all the more important. The attacks that we are seeing in this country right now are unprecedented and have happened before. The same rhetoric, you will remember some of the exact same laws that were passed a century ago are coming up again. We talked specifically about a registry, right? That immigrants actually had to register, the ways that the census was used illegally to round people up and how that data was collected to target communities, about the racial profiling and xenophobia that we see on the rise and how that's impacted Muslim and Arab American communities, especially since 9/11, and how the Islamophobia that we're fighting is actually the same feeling as the yellow peril narrative, how it's propagated in propaganda, in culture, in movies. What we have to do to stand in solidarity to demand never again. A lot of the cry nowadays is never again is now, making the connections between what happened to the previous generation and what's happening to communities today. Unfortunately, in the past few years, this has also risen to the level of family separation and anti-immigrant sentiment. When I think about family separations history in this country, it is a long history. It is a long history going back to slavery. It is a long history going back to indigenous communities and how families were torn apart as a systematic way to take power over those communities. That's the same thing that actually happened at Manzanar too. Children ripped from families and put in an orphanage, those folks who were orphans there. And so today, the Japanese and Japanese American community continues to stand in solidarity with immigrants and against family separation and detention. You'll see that photo, these two photos actually have been taken all in the last 6 months of community members who actually did a delegation down to one of those sites where there is a current concentration camp of children and family members being incarcerated for who they are. So I'm going to call and end today just by saying thank you, and you are so welcome to join us at this year's annual pilgrimage. It's going to be a really powerful day to talk a lot about what has happened and what we need to continue to do. There is a bus coming, and Yaki-sensei has the information for that. Just come here from Claremont. You can also make the trip up yourself, and we definitely welcome you and are looking forward to hopefully seeing you there and having your voices join in the fight for justice for all people in this country. Thank you.
Regarding Manzanar, I've visited Manzanar on several occasions, including recently in February, and it's a very impressive site, no doubt. But I've also been to the posting camp, I've been to Topaz. These are very, very different sites compared to Manzanar. Right? You have memorials that are very difficult to get to, and I'm wondering, will there be an effort to create something even approaching what you see at Manzanar at these other sites?
Thank you. Yeah, those are great questions. I think when I think about the lasting legacy of camp, and for my life, a lot of it's been around activism and organizing because that's the path that my grandmother chose to take. That's not the path that most of the community took. And so legacies of trauma and the ways that the fear is at a very deep level still in existence, I think exists within the Japanese American community, right? We are not a monolith. I mean, first of all, if I'm part of the community, I look like this. We're not a monolith, right? And thinking about the different ways that folks within the community responded to camp and have come to it. I don't know the specific details of why there's resistance for these two sites, and just pull up the map so folks can again see where all these different places were all across the country. So I don't know if I can speak specifically why resistance in those places, but when I think about what actually the impact is on a community, that is part of it, right? And I think of that trauma as pretty deep. There's some great health studies and psychologists and researchers, including Satsuki Ina, who's written a lot about this trauma and that impact in the community. And I think right now also about all these kids who are being torn apart from their families with order and what that lasting legacy will be for generations. So I'm not surprised to hear that there's resistance, right? My grandmother's own family didn't want her to do this work for a while. And even though there have been apologies, that continues. And then in regards to the different sites, actually at the exhibit, I can't remember where the Asian library is, it's upstairs, I suppose. Part of the collection there includes one of the resources my grandmother made actually in the 70s, encouraging other camp survivors to start forming pilgrimages and forming committees to make the legacy told. And so part of it is there are now many pilgrimages that have happened and were inspired by the work that my grandmother and others started here at Manzanar for other places. And you see the vast difference in resource and the storytelling because it's the work people did, right? These things don't happen without effort. They happen because hard-working people just come together in their living rooms and decide to make them happen. And so there is a growing movement of folks, especially, don't say my generation, who are really working to tell the story, tell it accurately in those different places. And so actually afterwards, I bet my dad could tell you the full details as the current chair, what all the other committees are currently doing and how those manifest. But yeah, thanks. Other questions, comments, reflections? They don't only have to be questions.
You're a wonderful public speaker.
Oh, thank you.
It's a fantastic story, and so, humanly, so much good as it is. Great to be here.
Thank you. I often tell it crying, if I'm honest. Yeah.
Was there or is there any connection between the pilgrimage and and say the Green New Deal and attempt to expand?
That's a great question, especially transparently for my day job. I work at the Sierra Club. One of my jobs is to work on the Green New Deal. And so, yeah, I think for me there's a lot of how do we tell the stories of what these things are connected. So my thesis, I think also is somewhere perhaps on display here. The theory of my thesis was that there was a direct connection between water and forced relocation and incarceration. And so I tell the repeated story of the Owens Valley's relationship between water and incarceration. So with the Paiute peoples, the first peoples that were there, the indigenous community, and how they were forcibly removed from their lands, about how the water crab in that area and the white farmers who were there were losing their land, and some actually also incarcerated in relation to water, and how Manzanar was specifically chosen as a site because of its water resource. Originally, the plans were to have 40,000 incarcerees at Manzanar. It peaked at about 10,000, but they needed water for 40,000 people. And if you're in the middle of the desert, the #1 resource that you're going to need access to is water. And so the other way I also tell the story in my thesis is about water as resistance. And so specifically looking at camp of how people were able to relate to the water in the desert as a means of fighting back against it. I shared this in a class earlier. One of my favorite parts of the site at Manzanar is at the reservoir, because incarcerees actually went up early to help. My uncles went up early to build the barracks and actually build their own prisons. And they also built the reservoir, the water reservoir. And you can go there and you can actually see graffiti written into the concrete. And some of it's in Japanese, and there's all different types of sentiments. My favorite piece of graffiti that's written in the concrete says, "I love myself." And the way a self-declaration of love in a prison camp, right, is the way of saying, you're not going to take my humanity. And I love that. It was only safe enough to write in concrete that was hidden underwater. And so I haven't made the connection yet with the Green New Deal in the pilgrimage. I'll have to think on that one. But there's definitely a lot of stories of water and how that directly plays in with this. Yeah, thank you. Sensei.
Can you speak about the gardens and fishing and how that played in part connects?
Absolutely. So those are my other two examples from my thesis of how people use water as resistance. So a lot of folks are farmers and gardeners, and the food was less than desirable. And so my grandmother shared that sometimes at the mess halls, on the rice, they would take a slop of apple butter and put it on top of the mound of rice and serve it to folks. And apple butter is not on rice in Japanese cuisine. My grandmother hated apple butter forever because of that. Apples, Manzanar, being named apples. There were apple orchards at Manzanar. There's a lot of kind of connections there. But the food at Manzanar was less than desirable. So one of the things incarcerees did was actually started growing their own food to feed their own people. And so they actually were able to get water resources to be able to start planting gardens, to plant crops like nasu, like Japanese eggplant, right? So people could actually start eating food that was healthy for them. Because especially a lot of the Issei were getting really sick. The medical facilities at camp were far subpar. The child mortality rate from births was multiple-fold worse than what the neighboring community next door has. There's a lot of health concerns, and food being a big part of our health. People actually grew gardens. They also had gardens, sculpture gardens. People stole bags of concrete. There's a famous story in one of the gardens there where they actually stole a ton of concrete to build a beautiful garden and beautifying a prison, right? Beautifying their physical place to help do that same resistance. It feels the same to me as inscribing "I love myself" in concrete. And several folks actually snuck out at night, hid from those watchtowers, climbed through the barbed wire fence, and went fishing in the neighborhood streams, and were able to catch fish to also feed themselves. It's kind of funny because actually some of the photos of camp show people fishing, so they must have known some folks were getting out. But they used fishing as a way of culturally also getting out and actually doing that. See here and here.
Just a couple of things to tell you. I taught a Head Start in Grenada, which was a Machi detention center. And it was kind of sad because it was for farm workers and to get them sort of out of the city. It's on the little hill where the Amachi detention center was. And that's when I first learned about the history. And all of these places had grave sites of people because they're unmarked and people's souls are there. So we should probably do something to honor those graveyards that are around those centers. The other thing that happened when I came to California to go to junior college, I ran into a kid who grew up in a detention center by the name of Fred Morisaki. And Fred, he was in the National Guard in 1964. There were the riots in LA. And he went up with a lot of other young men there. So when Fred came back to Palomar College in San Diego, I asked him, how many blacks did you shoot in Watts? And he said what they did is they formed a platoon of all the Japanese boys and sent them out, and they went into Watts, found a community center and played pinball and ping pong with the students. Fred said, no blacks interned us. We were not about to shoot at blacks.
Thanks for sharing that. At Manzanar, there is I'm sure I have a photo in here somewhere, a tower. Here we go. And that says IDAAS, which means Soul Consoling Tower. And that was erected to honor the people who had passed away there. That's right in the middle of the cemetery. There are multiple unmarked graves, including children's graves there. And I should name, it's important to recognize, before the 1969 pilgrimage my grandmother went on, religious leaders had actually been going back for years to the cemetery and praying. And so at the end of every pilgrimage, we still have an interfaith service, the Shinto and Buddhist and Muslim, and Christian, a really beautiful ceremony to honor those who've actually passed. So thank you for that. So I can hear.
Oh, when I was a teenager, I worked for a man named Ken Kimura, who ran a nursery in Laverne, and he had that exact same story. He said that he and a friend had gone through the wire, gone up into the Sierras, which are 3 or 4 miles to the west, gone fishing, and nobody missed them for a couple of days, and then they'd snuck back.
Pretty amazing how folks resist incarceration. That's really cool. Thanks. Other folks? I think I saw another hand somewhere. Sure.
Just listening to you has been really, really interesting to me because I'm not that aware and much more aware in the last hour. So I so appreciate it. I tend to, we've moved recently to California and back. And I've gotten very involved in detention issues in Alejandro and also those trying to seek asylum in Tijuana. And I just, to me, the history, we keep, many times we think we've moved beyond, beyond the mistakes we've made in the past. And it's really sad that we continually repeat what we've done. And we're constantly, this racism that just kind of comes up and begins to characterize this country. And the more we work to try to prohibit that from being a part of our identity, because it's known around the world. And there's many partnerships we can develop between different groups that are suffering this kind of racism and discrimination. I mean, the ICE raids that are going on in communities now, I mean, there's, these underground communication systems going on about how do you avoid ICE that's coming up the road now in the next 20 minutes, something like that, those that are incarcerated just because they were seeking asylum from violence. and the way we've labeled them as racist, I mean, as rapists and this and that. So what you're doing is so important, and especially if you're reaching out, as you're reaching out to the Muslim community and other communities. I just want to thank you for all your work.
Thanks. Yeah, we've got a 400+ year legacy of white supremacy that we got to heal from.
Just have to really, really address this issue.
And then I think about the ICE raids, and I think about the FBI raids at the East Side, right? So, yeah, thank you. And actually, even the yellow peril imagery, right? There's a lot of race and rapism, right? Like that image. What's being conveyed? Right back here. And how we're framing, like, yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about how you use your time with Mona? You both sort of, you use the studies that you did, make it personal.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because I feel like for a lot of students who don't really find themselves in much in curriculum, don't really know how to sort of tap into their own life history in a way that can make you resilient, right? And put academic language to suffering. Right? Can you talk a little bit about your process for that and how beyond school that's kind of thing?
Absolutely. Yeah. Writing a thesis is hard, right? We've got plenty of students in here dreading it or currently like powering through your last pages. For me, part of what happened, right, when I was finishing up my first year, my grandmother passed during my finals week. So I had taken incompletes and was not sure I wanted to come back sophomore year. I really struggled. My dad could tell you, Shariar could tell you, Sefa could tell you. I was really not sure I wanted to be in school here anymore. If I wanted to finish, I think I had multiple times requested transfer papers from Shariar. And so part of what helped me stay and why I was able to figure out how to move and grow through that really was trying to actually take what I was learning in classes and relate to this deep pain I was feeling of losing my grandma. And I came here to learn from her as much as I came here to learn from this institution. And I no longer had her here. And so how was I going to use my classes and my work at the ARC and other institutions on campus to actually feed my soul? And so a lot of what I did in my thesis is actually do a really deep dive in my family history, right? And I got to use the opportunity and the incredible privilege it is to be just able to have 4 years where you're only responsible for learning and only responsible for growing and only responsible for challenging what you think about, to look at my family history. And I got to rewatch interviews and oral histories that I was so lucky folks did of my grandmother, and actually got to like really learn her story in a different way than we learn over Thanksgiving dinner, right? And so throughout my thesis, part of what I actually did is I wove in poetry. So every chapter starts with a poem. My grandmother was a poet, and she was part of an Asian women's and Japanese women writers collective. And so I thought, you know what, I want her words to come to life, not just her rally speeches, which are powerful, but also her poems and her songs. I put art and creative expression in every part of my chapter. So part of it was, let's expand what counts and what's considered valid in the academy as traditional, like what's knowledge, right? So we're gonna put in art, and I put in art pieces repeatedly as a way to say, you know what, here's how people actually healed from trauma, right? To how you move past, if you can move past what that deep, living behind barbed wire, I don't know how you really do heal entirely from. And so I used the opportunity, the privilege of being here to then say, let me learn about my people, let me learn about my family, and what does that mean for where I want to go, right? What does that mean for where I want to be next? And would often be asking myself, I'm learning theory like the Perez principles, like actually reading theory, and I think, well, how did grandma actually do this? What was her version of this? How did she make sure that she was inclusive in her spaces so that people from different walks of life, including those who didn't agree with what she was doing, were able to be seen, right? How did she make sure it was bottom up, right? She wasn't top down, and it's been really a grassroots effort, not letting the more formalized institutions within the Japanese American community be the only ones who determined what would happen, what was legitimate. How did she create opportunities for people to speak for themselves? Where is she endlessly creating vehicles and moments for people to really live that up? And so a lot of it was like learning theory. Like I studied this in an intro to environmental justice studies class. These were the Hema's principles written in 1996 from Hema's New Mexico, right? A pretty founding document in the environmental movement. And what does it mean to apply that in my work today, right? So like, how did grandma do it? And also like, how do I actually live these? And that was like the heart of the chapter that I wrote for Char's book. Way less academic than when I was writing my thesis, let me say, and how that shifted. So, thanks. Thanks for that. How are we on time? Also, that's what I'm not sure of.
So, thank you so much for such a broad and interesting talk and very engaging talk. Please join me in thanking Monica for coming. Done the Japanese American community and also Monica is very proud, so thank you. I just want to remind you that there's a reception upstairs in the third Asian library on the third floor, so you can just follow the stairs up and you can find it right there. And in addition, there's also an exhibit right here. It's on this floor that is also related to this series of events. Thanks once again.
Thank you.